I still remember the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I was sitting in a lawyer's office on a gray Tuesday morning, wearing the same black coat I'd worn to his funeral 3 days before. My eyes were still swollen, my throat still hurt from crying. And the lawyer slid a document across the table and said my name, Charlotte Reeves. Not Renata, not Fletcher, not anyone from his family who had spent the last week flooding that house like they owned it. Me. Ethan left everything to me. And I sat there thinking, why? Why me? I was never his girlfriend, never his fiancée. I was just the woman he called when the world got too loud, the one who never asked for anything in return. So why was my name on that will? Before I tell you everything, if this kind of story stays with you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to share changed how I understand love, loyalty, and the real cost of choosing wrong. My name is Charlotte Reeves. I'm 34 years old. I work as a hospital administrator. I wake up early, I keep my apartment clean, and I have never once in my life caused a scene in public. I'm not dramatic. I'm not the kind of woman people write stories about. Or at least, I didn't used to be. I met Ethan 6 years ago at a friend's wedding. It was raining so hard the outdoor ceremony got moved inside. Everyone was frustrated. Ethan thought it was hilarious. That was the first thing I noticed about him, that he laughed where other people complained. We talked for 4 hours that night, about everything and nothing. By the end of it, I already knew I was in trouble. We became inseparable fast, not in a loud, obvious way. It was quiet, natural, like we had always known each other and were just catching up on lost time. He'd call me on his drive home from work. I'd pick up every single time. We had our usual cafe, corner table, bad lighting, the best coffee in the city. We'd sit there for hours, and the staff would have to hint at us to leave. I knew what it was. I knew what I felt. I just never said it out loud. Because Ethan had Renata. She was everything I wasn't. Polished, loud, magnetic. The kind of woman who walked into a room and rearranged it. I understood why he was with her. I just didn't understand why he kept needing me. Then, one afternoon, about 18 months in, he asked to meet at our cafe. He was nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup, laughing a little too quickly at nothing. And then he told me he was going to propose to Renata. I smiled. I told him that was wonderful. I asked if he'd picked a ring yet. He looked so relieved, like he'd been afraid of my reaction. He should have been. I walked home in the cold, sat on my bathroom floor, and cried until I had nothing left. I told myself to pull back, create distance, protect what was left of my dignity. And I tried. I genuinely tried. But Ethan didn't let me disappear. He kept calling, kept showing up. I just needed to hear your voice. What do you do with that? I let him back in. I hated that I did, but I let him back in anyway. The wedding was beautiful. I sat in row 7 and watched him marry her, and I smiled through every single second of it. Marriage looked good on them from the outside. The photos were stunning. The apartment they moved into was beautiful. Renata posted everything: Sunday brunches, anniversary dinners, weekend trips. Their life looked like a magazine spread. But Ethan started calling more. Not less, more. I noticed it gradually. The calls got longer, the laughs got shorter. There was something sitting underneath his voice that he wasn't saying directly. A kind of heaviness that didn't belong to a man who was supposed to be happy. I asked him once, "Are you okay?" He said yes, too quickly. That was my answer. This time I held my ground. I told him clearly I was not going to be the emotional escape hatch for a marriage he needed to fix. I said it kindly, but I said it firmly. He went quiet for a moment, then said, "You're right." But he still called the following week, and the week after that. And somewhere between those calls, the rumors started. Renata had been seen with someone, a colleague, twice at the same restaurant, then a weekend where Ethan thought she was visiting her sister and she wasn't. I didn't bring it to him. It wasn't my place. But then it stopped being a rumor. Ethan found out on a Tuesday night. He called me at 11. Didn't say much, just asked if he could come over. He sat down on my kitchen floor, this tall, broad-shouldered man, and just folded. No tears, no shouting, just silence. The kind of silence that's louder than anything. I sat down next to him on that cold floor. I didn't offer advice, didn't say I told you so. I just stayed. For 2 hours, I just stayed. Ethan confronted Renata the next morning. I wasn't there, but he told me everything afterward, word for word, and even hearing it secondhand made my hands curl into fists. He didn't go in angry. That was the thing about Ethan. He always led with calm. He asked her directly, gave her space to explain, gave her the dignity of a real conversation. She didn't want dignity. She wanted a fight. Renata told him he was boring, that she had outgrown him, that his ambition was small and his world was smaller. She said she had spent 2 years shrinking herself to fit into his quiet little life, and she was done. And then she said it. "You always cared more about that sad little friend of yours anyway." Ethan asked for a divorce. That's when things turned vicious. Renata froze their joint accounts overnight. She called his mother before he did, crafted her version of the story perfectly. By the time Ethan reached his family, they had already chosen a side, and it wasn't his. His brother Fletcher was the worst of it. Fletcher had been quietly borrowing money from Renata for over a year, so when she needed loyalty, she collected on it. Fletcher stood in that family group chat and called Ethan the problem, called him emotionally unavailable, cold. Ethan was devastated, not by the divorce, by his own family. And in the middle of all of it, his father had a stroke and passed within 2 weeks. Grief and legal battles and family betrayal all at once. I drove Ethan to the funeral. I stood beside him the entire service. Not one family member acknowledged me. Not one. But I wasn't there for them. I held his arm and I didn't let go. And that was enough. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Ethan called me on a Wednesday afternoon. His voice was different. Not sad, not angry, just stripped down, like something had been removed from it. He told me he'd been having chest pains for weeks, that he'd finally gone to the doctor, that the doctor had referred him to a specialist, and that the specialist had sat him down and used words he hadn't expected to hear at 36 years old. Aggressive heart condition. Surgery required. Soon. I didn't panic on the phone. He needed me steady, so I stayed steady. But after we hung up, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, and I cried so hard my whole body shook. Then I wiped my face, walked back inside, and started making a plan. I took 2 weeks off work. I went with him to every appointment. I organized his medical paperwork into a folder so clean and color-coded, his surgeon actually commented on it. I stocked his refrigerator, researched his medications, set alarms on his phone for every dose. Renata never called, not once. Fletcher reached out 2 days before the surgery, not to offer support, to ask whether Ethan had updated his insurance policy. I didn't tell Ethan that part. The night of the surgery, I sat in the waiting room alone, plastic chair, flickering overhead light, still in my work clothes because I'd come straight from the office. I didn't sleep. When the surgeon finally came out and said it went well, I exhaled so hard the woman next to me put her hand on my shoulder. When Ethan opened his eyes, I was there. He looked at me for a long moment. Didn't say a word. Just reached out and held my hand, and didn't let go for a very long time. Ethan recovered slowly, but he recovered. He never talked about the surgery much afterward, never made it dramatic. That wasn't his way. He just quietly started living differently, more deliberately, like every ordinary day had suddenly become something worth noticing. He called more, laughed easier, said things he probably would have swallowed before. I noticed the change. It made me happy in a way I couldn't quite name. What I didn't know, what he never told me, was that somewhere in those quiet months of recovery, he visited his attorney alone. He updated his will entirely. Then he wrote a letter, sealed it in an envelope with my name on the front, and left it with the lawyer with specific instructions. I knew nothing about any of it. 8 months later, on an ordinary Thursday morning, Ethan collapsed at home. Cerebral aneurysm. Sudden. Catastrophic. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. I got the call from his neighbor. I drove to the hospital already knowing, sat in that same waiting room where I had prayed so hard 8 months before, and this time, there was nothing to wait for. The funeral was tense. Fletcher organized everything and made sure I felt invisible throughout. 4 days later, the will was read. Fletcher arrived at the lawyer's office like he was collecting something already his. Renata sent a representative, a woman in a gray suit who wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. And then the lawyer read the document. Every property, every account, his mother's ring, the vintage car he had spent 3 years restoring in his garage. All of it to Charlotte Reeves. Fletcher shot to his feet and shouted, called me a predator, called it manipulation. His face was red, his voice was shaking. I didn't flinch. I looked at the lawyer and quietly asked what I needed to sign. That evening, I drove home alone. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Ethan had eaten dinner 100 times, and I held the sealed envelope in both hands for a long time. His handwriting was on the front, just my name, Charlotte, written in that slightly uneven way he always wrote, like his hand could never quite keep up with his thoughts. I opened it slowly. 2 pages, both sides filled. He started by saying he had written this 3 times and thrown away every version because nothing felt like enough, that he hoped this one came close. He wrote that he had known, long before he was honest enough to admit it, that I was the most significant person in his life. Not the loudest, not the most obvious, but the most real. He wrote that choosing Renata had cost him years he could never recover. Not because she was terrible, but because he had spent those years living slightly sideways from the truth. He wrote that I had never once asked him for acknowledgement, never demanded to be seen, never made him feel guilty for the position he had put me in. And then he wrote the part that broke me completely open. You showed up on my worst days without being asked. You sat on my kitchen floor. You slept in a waiting room in your work clothes. You held my arm at my father's funeral when my own family looked through you. That isn't friendship, Charlotte. That's the purest kind of love I've ever witnessed. I was just too much of a coward to call it what it was. I'm sorry. This is all I have left to give. Take it. Build something beautiful. You always knew how to do that. I folded the letter carefully, pressed it against my chest, and for the first time since he died, I let myself cry without trying to stop. Fletcher took it to court. He hired an attorney, gathered the family, and built a case around the idea that I had manipulated a vulnerable man, that I had positioned myself strategically, that the will wasn't valid. He lost. Every argument dismantled, every accusation dissolved. Ethan had been of sound mind, full legal standing, and had documented everything with his attorney meticulously, almost like he knew someone would challenge it. Maybe he did. Renata's representative never came back. Fletcher stopped returning calls from people who had publicly supported him. Turns out, loyalty built on borrowed money has a very short shelf life. I didn't celebrate, didn't make a single phone call to gloat. I just moved forward. The first thing I did was donate a portion of the inheritance to the cardiac unit at the hospital where Ethan had his surgery. I had it dedicated in his name. The staff hung a small plaque on the wall. I stood there and read it 3 times. I kept the letter, I kept his mother's ring, and I kept the car. It took me 4 months to learn how to drive a manual transmission, but I figured it out, just like he always knew I would.